Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Sorang, and joining me here in the studio is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program. Thank you for being here. The US midterm elections, widely seen as a possible watershed moment for Donald Trump's presidency, was held on November 6th. And as predicted by polls and surveys, the Republican Party held on to the control of the Senate, while the Democratic Party won back the House of Representatives. So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we take a closer look at the US midterm election outcome and the possible ripple effects it could have for the world at large, including the two Koreas. So did the election results come in line with your overall expectations, or were there surprise results?
It was generally how I expected it. There were a few surprises. The Democrats really didn't have a great chance of winning the Senate in the first place. And it was exciting to see that, there was such a great voter turnout and that they eventually won the House. There were some surprises in terms of states flipping a certain way. Texas had a surprisingly high blue voter turnout, although they didn't win. So I do think that there's been some changes, certainly, with, the youth vote, but it basically went as planned.
Right. And Anne, what about you? Were you surprised?
I think it was aligned with my expectations. Right now, because of the political climate in the U.S., it really depends on who you ask. In the run-up to the election, there was a lot of talk about the blue wave, how big it would be, and after the election, I think it's still being debated how big that wave was and if it was even, dark blue, light blue.
Right. And Kelly, you mentioned that there was a high voter turnout, especially among the younger crowd, that younger group, especially those under 30, and early voting was surprisingly high as well. Fabian, how do you think this affected the overall result?
I think among the young voter groups, the majority voted for Democrats.
Right.
I think 60% at least, and for basically females also had a tendency to rather vote for Democrats.
Now, the midterm elections, they were also marred by several hate crimes leading up to the day of the election. And some have blamed President Trump's inflammatory rhetoric for fueling the far right and instigating these crimes.
The Democrat Party is openly inviting millions of illegal aliens to break our laws, violate our borders, and overwhelm our nation. You catch a damn killer. You catch a bad hombre. You catch a bad one.
Do you think Trump's comments ahead of the election were directly responsible for encouraging the far right?
Well, in the run-up to the election, we did see Trump really ramp up the anti-immigrant sentiment in an effort to inflame and panic the public into voting Republican.
Go to work for Boeing and go to work for Raytheon and for Lockheed and do a great job. These are some hardened criminals coming in.
And I think that according to some exit polls, it has been shown that Trump's comments did affect the voter turnout.
So if it affected the voter turnout, how do you think it affected the overall result, especially the hate crimes?
I think it does fuel the far right. Obviously, not everyone in the right is committing hate crimes.
Right.
But I don't think there's any question that the Trump administration planted some stories to basically incite the public to be hateful. The migrant caravan story that's been all over the media, whether it be the New York Times or Fox News, is a perfect example of that. I don't think there's any question that that was, trying to be an inflammatory thing for the public. The very genesis of the idea of 5,000 people in a caravan being met with 15,000 soldiers shows that. It's just not something that, our armed forces normally do, and it just doesn't make any sense from a military perspective. So yes, I would say the Trump administration was kind of trying to fuel extremists.
But as you mentioned, I mean, also the media played into the hands of Trump, because how it was reported, actually not even about which angle you take, but how over-proportionally dominant it was reported. I think it was ridiculous, because it's nothing very unusual, but it's basically, the Republicans, or Trump especially, like playing out the immigrant card to mobilize his voting base. And actually that's something we also know from Korea to some extent in the past. It was always during elections when the conservatives here also played the North Korea card, because they know that security issues are one of their main strengths. To mobilize their voters.
So when you say the media played into it, you're saying the media covered it to a greater degree?
They made it a bigger issue than it actually is, in my opinion.
Okay.
I absolutely agree with you, yeah.
Now, it's been widely said that this midterm election, it's a battle of Trump supporters and Trump opponents, as opposed to a battle between the Democrats and the Republicans. And on the morning after the election, Trump declared victory in this midterm election.
The Republican Party defied history to expand our Senate majority while significantly beating expectations in the House for the midterm and midterm year.
What do you think about that? Do you think that it indeed was a victory for Trump?
Well, it was no surprise that Trump took to Twitter after the election and tweeted that it was a big win, a big victory for his party. He also said that those who were with him won, and those who were against him could say goodbye. But, a lot of Republicans who did support him and his policies were not reelected. So just like anything in American politics, it's a case of alternate realities.
Alternate realities. Now let's bring the focus to Korea. Pundits here in South Korea have also paid close attention to the US midterm elections, given its potential ramifications on Washington's North Korea policies. Now that the Democrats have taken charge of the House of Representatives, how do you think Washington's policy on North Korea will change?
I don't think it will change radically. Democrats have come out and kind of railed against Trump for giving Kim Jong-un summits, but at this point it's already done, right? So we're going to continue to schedule these hopefully in the future because we've gone down this path. But ultimately, right now, there's a lot of tension between North Korea and the United States again, because North Korea is basically making a nuclear ultimatum, saying that they're going to build up their arsenal if the U.S. doesn't lift sanctions. And both Democrats and Republicans, this is one of the things that they can agree on in terms of foreign policy, is that they don't want to lift sanctions right now without seeing more evidence of denuclearization. So honestly, I don't think it will have a great effect.
And do you echo that sentiment? Do you think we won't see much changes?
I don't think we'll see very many changes in terms of the actual policy toward North Korea. What could happen is that the Democratic control of the House, they will ask for more accountability and checks and maybe more information from President Trump about his negotiations. So in exercising their oversight, it could slow down some kind of process.
Okay. Now, before the elections, USA Today, they quoted a foreign policy expert based in US that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un may be hoping for a Trump victory in the midterm elections. What do you think might be North Korea's perception of the election results?
I think probably rather the opposite, because now that the House is in the hands of the Democrats and the Senate remains Republican, I think it will be rather harder to have a consistent North Korea strategy. I would expect that since there will be much more investigations about Trump's scandals, his financial dealings, actually the North Korea issue might lose a little bit of importance.
I'd love to take the sanctions off, but they have to be responsive too. It's two-way street. But we're not in any rush.
But I thought you're meeting with Kim Jong-un, sir.
Sometime next year, I would say.
Sometime next year?
Sometime early next year.
But on the other hand, that also means that looking ahead of 2020, he needs a diplomatic gain or a diplomatic win. And after that catastrophe with the Iran deal, I think North Korea could potentially be such a diplomatic gain. But I think for North Korea, it doesn't make much of a difference, I think.
It probably doesn't make much of a difference. One thing that could happen, maybe they would be concerned that Democrats would bring the regime's human rights record into the picture and really focus on that.
Actually, there were two times when it actually made a big difference. In 1994, when Bill Clinton made the first nuclear deal with North Korea, and then there was a total swing, and then the House and the Senate was in the hands of the Republicans, and then that fell apart. And also in 2006, I still remember when Bush was calling North Korea the axis of evil. But after that, there was also midterm elections, and both the House and the Senate had gone to the Democrats. And after that, actually, his position towards North Korea became more softer, and he toned down his rhetoric.
Yeah. Now, staying with North Korea, on the day of the election, a high-level meeting between Pyongyang and Washington scheduled for November 8th was abruptly postponed. Some reports saying that it was Pyongyang that initiated the postponement. What might have been some of the reasons behind this delay?
Well, you know, it's kind of a he said, she said game because Trump said that the postponement with John Bolton was because of a travel schedule. And so,
travel schedules.
Yeah, and so I think there's some strategizing probably going on both ends. North Korea is probably thinking about what it's going to do if Trump is distracted with his own domestic affairs now that he's going to be at bat with Democrats in the House. It could be that North Korea is trying to backtrack on some of its statements about, you know, building up its nuclear arsenal if it doesn't get sanctions. And the United States also needs to strategize on their end. So I don't know who's responsible for that postponement, but I think right now everyone's trying to take a step back and just think about what's the next step forward.
Right, and it doesn't look like that North Korea issue is on the higher priority of things.
Right.
Now, meanwhile, in South Korea, the Moon Jae-in government has been busy laying the groundwork for further inter-Korean economic cooperation and improved ties with North Korea, completing the disarmament of the joint security area in the process. Do you think the US midterm election results could bring a change to Seoul's North Korea policy?
No, I don't think so. I think they will keep their stance and keep pushing forward. But of course, what can, for example, Seoul offer at this point additionally to North Korea? I mean, with the sanctions, they basically reached a plateau, and they cannot push the economic cooperation much further without endangering the alliance with the US. So I think they also need some progress on the other front, which is the US-North Korea talks and denuclearization. But probably Moon Jae-in will not, or will try to lessen its dependence on the US.
What else can the Moon Jae-in government do to break this impasse between North Korea and the US?
Well, I think the Moon Jae-in government has actually done a really good job acting independently of the United States, doing things like removing posts in the JSA, the Joint Security Area, or scheduling meetings to talk about a potential inter-Korean train line in the future.
민족 경제를 균형적으로 발전시키기 위한 실질적 대책을 만들어 나가기로 했습니다. 환경이 조성되는 대로 개성공단과 금강산 관광 사업의 정상화도 이루어질 것입니다.
You know, move that kind of sense of diplomacy forward is probably the best way to do it, and I think South Korea's positioned, and the Moon Jae-in administration knows that that's how they can move separately of the United States and the sanctions regime.
Okay. Now, if we go back to earlier this year, President Trump, he first mentioned the second Pyongyang-Washington summit immediately following the third inter-Korean summit of 2018, raising hopes that a declaration to formally end the Korean War could come by the end of the year.
전쟁 없는 한반도가 시작되었습니다. 남과 북은 오늘 한반도 전 지역에서 전쟁을 일으킬 수 있는 모든 위험을 없애기로 합의했습니다.
We have an agreement to work out another summit. The location is being worked on, the time is being worked on, and we'll be announcing it.
Now, however, critics say that the signing of a formal peace treaty isn't likely to happen anytime soon. despite the presidential Blue House still holding on to hopes that a formal peace agreement could be reached by the end of 2018, coupled with a visit to Seoul by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
나는 문재인 대통령에게 가까운 시일 안에 서울을 방문할 것을 약속했습니다.
정부는 판문점 선언에 명시된 바와 같이 올해 종전을 선언하고 이어서 평화 체제를 구축하기 위한 노력을 계속해 나갈 것입니다.
And judging by the current situation, how do you rate the possibility of Kim Jong-un coming to Seoul by the end of this year?
I think it's really hard to say, but given the fact that the Trump Kim Jong-un meeting will not happen this year, it's going to be early next year, he said. But he also said, he's in no rush, he's in no hurry. I think it's going to take quite some time.
We're going to change it because of trips that are being made. We're going to make it at another date. But we're very happy how it's going with North Korea. We think it's going fine. We're in no rush. We're in no hurry. The sanctions are on.
So quite unlikely to happen this year, do you think?
I think it's quite unlikely.
I would just add that, it wouldn't be the first time a deadline has been pushed back in efforts to, be diplomatic with North Korea.
Based on the recent statement of North Korea, I've decided to terminate the planned summit in Singapore on June 12th.
And when the announcement was first made, I think a lot of people who, followed these politics knew that maybe that was an unrealistic goal. And I don't think that necessarily means that in the future there won't be one if it's not signed in the next month and a half.
Right. Now, moving on from the two Koreas, the regional powers surrounding the Korean Peninsula, they have also put out statements regarding their opinions, their views on the election results. Out of China, Japan, and Russia, which country do you think is the most satisfied with the results?
Well, first of all, Congress doesn't really have much say in terms of trade with the United States. So I would say China, if anyone, would probably be the happiest. And that's just because, Democrats have railed against the U.S.-China trade war for a while now and how Trump has been upticking it with tariffs against Chinese imported goods. I think the Democrats might see in the future, at least some of them, that it's raising the price of imported goods in the United States, and they might respond accordingly. But honestly, that's just speculation because both Democrats and Republicans do want to push back on China.
Right.
Primarily because, there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States right now. There's hacking scandals, there's scandals about stealing foreign defense information from the U.S. So it's really a toss-up.
I think some analysts are a little bit confused as to why China would think that more Democrats or Democratic control of the House would help them. Because as Kelly mentioned before, being tougher on trade with China is really a bipartisan cause. Because Democrats have a history of supporting, labor unions, and this is something that they, by and large, align on with Republicans.
我们希望大家都能够安安静静地坐下来，认认真真地去谈，去谈出一个对双方都有利的这么一个结果。
When you're losing $400 to $500 billion a year, and it's going to China and coming away from our country and our taxpayers, I can't let that go on.
Okay, then do you think the election results would have any direct implications for the ongoing trade war?
Not too much, because as Anne mentioned, the Democrats are traditionally also very concerned about labor rights and protecting the jobs, and there's also some kind of anti-China sentiment. That's an issue that both parties could align on, actually.
Now, Kelly, both Kelly and Anne, you have mentioned that it is a bipartisan cause. Why do you think that is so, that the Democrats and the Republicans are both quite anti-China on this issue?
In general, I think the U.S. has a long history of feeling threatened by China. Sometimes I think it's just silly things like the mere size of China or the fact that it's a major global economy that's competing with the U.S., the fact that it's building itself up through manufacturing. But in more recent news, there have been scandals and questions about whether or not the Chinese are hacking U.S. companies, the U.S. government. There's been accusations of the Chinese meddling with elections, which we have no proof of as of right now. And there's also been an issue with Chinese hackers stealing information about United States technology, especially in the Defense Department. So it does kind of feel like China's on an offensive towards the United States. And I guess for them, the most peaceful way to retaliate would be trade.
Right. Now, the US-China trade war had spillover effects onto South Korea as well, not only in economic terms, but regarding North Korea issues as well.
Relationship seems very good. I think it's probably hurt a little bit by China, because China isn't really happy with what I'm doing on trade.
Do you think Trump can solve the North Korea issue without China's support?
No, I think China is the main factor. I mean, if they lift the sanctions, if they support North Korea economically, then there's no way to pressure North Korea. I mean, for Trump, for example, that's basically, he has the sanctions are a big card for him that he can play out to pressure North Korea, but he needs China on his side. So I think there must be some kind of compromise, because for China it's a way of trying to lift trade tariffs from the US and vice versa. So yes, right now probably China will not be on the side of Trump's maximum pressure strategy.
I would add that it also doesn't help the relationship between the United States and South Korea either. Part of this negotiation with North Korea does involve South Korea being a strong ally. And it's not as though South Korea is going to depart over the trade issue, but it does add tension, because the tariffs on Chinese goods inevitably affect South Korea's economy, because South Korea is supplying pieces of those goods to China. So I think it's kind of in the United States' best interest to think about that when dealing with the North Korea issue as well.
Now, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has long been known as one of the opponents of Trump, and she has spoken out against his trade protectionist stance on many occasions.
Tell NATO, you got to start paying your bills. The United States is not going to take care of everything. The United States of America was the piggy bank that everybody was robbing. And let me tell you, our allies in many cases were worse than our enemies.
Abschottung uns nicht weiterführt. Wir glauben, dass wir kooperieren müssen, dass Protektionismus nicht die richtige Antwort ist.
Fabian, how might the leaders of leaders in EU who have an anti-Trump stance, how do you think they are viewing the election results?
Well, they would be rather happy about it. I mean, Merkel, she will probably say it much more diplomatically, but she despises Trump. And that's actually the case for all political parties in Germany, except for the extreme right. They praise Trump. But basically the rejection of Trump's political ideas is something that most political spectrums of Germany can agree on. However, there are also some European leaders who really, really like Trump. That's, for example, in Italy, where you have a de facto almost fascist government, or like a really, really right-wing government. And so that you can see the split in between Europe is also whether you're on Trump's side or not on Trump's sides. But I think, for Germany and for France, it would be much better to deal with a different president than Trump.
Okay, this is my final question. Now that the midterm elections are over, it's quite possible, it's more than likely, that Trump will turn all his attention to the upcoming 2020 re-election campaign. And with at least 2, possibly 6 if he gets re-elected, years left in Donald Trump's presidency, what can the South Korean government do to come up with a good diplomatic strategy, taking into consideration the Trump factor?
I think, South Korea, in terms of its alliance with the United States, can keep doing what it's doing. In terms of its alliance with North Korea, which is building, South Korea really needs to think about how they can push forward diplomacy in small steps to keep the issue hot and live and in the headlines. And they can do that separately from the United States for the most part. They just need to be creative about it. And I think that, ultimately at the end of the day, we have to be careful in South Korea because, if Trump loses the next election, or even when Trump's presidency is over in potentially 6 years, North Korea could flip the switch again because, their relationship was really with Trump, not the United States. So South Korea also has to think about self-preservation in this process.
And Fabian?
Yeah, I would say that Moon Jae-in should keep on course, keep stable, because what he did in the past was quite successful. To the outside, he was praising Trump's ego and, you know, keeping him happy, so to say, but also had a very consistent own policy, and it basically put South Korea back into the driver's seat in inter-Korean affairs. And yeah, I would hope that he doesn't depend his own policy too much on a president that's really unreliable, and I have to say that very clear should not be the norm. I mean, he's a very outstanding political character, basically an accident of history that I hope doesn't repeat itself.
And what about you, Anne?
I think that Moon Jae-in has done a really great job, as Kelly and Fabian have mentioned, of working with both sides, the U.S. and North Korea. So it should continue on working independently.
Okay, all right, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your input. As with any election outcome, some may be content with the results of the US midterms, while disappointment may reign on the opposite side of the vote. But now that the dust has settled, it remains to be seen how the election results will impact the US as well as other countries across the globe. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.